What's going on? I'm Colion Noir, and thanks for joining us again. Today on CN Live, Richard Ryan is here to talk about the last developments with Prop 63. We're also going to separate fact from fiction with the 50 cal. And then Maj Toure joins us live today about the elections, Black Guns Matter, and some Philly flash mobs. We have a special video message from all of you from Wayne LaPierre, and then we'll take some of your questions. Now, maybe some of the biggest setbacks for the Second Amendment last week was the passing of California's Proposition 63. This law not only bans magazines with more than 10 rounds, but it will require permits, background checks for all ammo purchases as well. So, joining me live today is Richard Ryan, who knows all about California's anti-gun laws. Now he's here to talk with me about Prop 63. What's going on, man?
What's happening, brother? How you doing?
Had an interesting weekend. I had a little bout of food poisoning, but other than that, I'm good. How about yourself?
I'm all right. Grinding it out.
Yeah, as usual, man. So, there was a kind of we had a huge victory for the Second Amendment last week, but then we also had some losses. And you know how I feel about California. I in many ways, I hate and love the place at the same time. So when I heard about Prop 63 passing, it really bothered me in a lot of ways. And it's just, it frustrates me. And I know, and if I'm frustrated, I know you are, you pretty much got to be just outside of yourself in that regard.
Yeah, well, I mean, there's a lot of things in that, right? Not just Prop 63, but California's Attorney General, Kamala Harris, is now a senator. So a lot of people don't realize that, that's another loss for Second Amendment rights in the state of California, because Jerry Brown, Kamala Harris have been extremely open about their views and stance on firearms, ammunition, and stuff along those lines. And specifically, the problem I have with Prop 63 is a lot of people will say, hey, it's good to have background checks or to do this or to do that. And, to some extent, I could concede that where, you do background checks on people, but the more barriers you put between being able to obtain these things, the more challenging it is. And if there's ever anybody who's had difficulty with this, it'd be me. I've spent the better part of 7 years trying to get my large capacity, which I'm so frustrated with everyone. It's become common for everyone to call 15-round magazines or 30-round magazines large capacity when they're standard capacity, right? So I know that's splitting hairs with us, but it's frustrating when people improperly refer to certain things, and it just builds this preconceived notion in the back of people's minds where they're like, hey, well, what do you need a large capacity? Why don't you just need standard? Well, it is standard capacity. So it's frustrating in that sense that they define it wrong, but also when they put these barriers between things. I've been trying to get an 11-round magazine permit for handguns and rifles because I didn't get to California until after all these laws were enacted. So I had
you don't have anything grandfathered.
Right. So I had to apply for what's called the California Dangerous Weapons Permit and their high capacity magazine permits. And I've spent the better part of $100,000 in being compliant with them, attorney's fees, and 7 years of my life where they've investigated me. They've gone in neighborhoods that I've lived, and they interviewed random people and neighbors, tell them, hey, Richard's trying to get an assault weapons permit. Have you ever seen him kick his dog or, show any signs of aggression towards his girlfriend or anything? And then so they approved me administratively, approved the field investigation, and still for years they've just sat on it. And that's the frustrating thing that I have when people say, oh, well, Prop 63, it's not that big of a deal. It's adding background checks. Well, on paper, you see these little things and it sounds good, but in reality, it ends up just hurting people down the road. So
I think the biggest issue, too, is when we talk about this stuff, we always constantly have new people coming into this conversation. And for us that have been in the conversation, we know the things that have been implemented in the past. So what you end up happening is you have people who just arriving in the conversation or say, well, this seems reasonable. This seems logical. Why don't you guys just compromise? You don't have an unfettered right to own a firearm, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And I've said this before, and I'll say it again. We've been compromising. We've been compromising for decades now. But they don't know this. They just come into this. So then when they go in the booth and they see Proposition 63, and then they read a headline that says, background checks for ammo. on the surface, it sounds like it makes perfect sense in their world. That's because they don't know anything about ammo. They don't know about the things that you and I have to deal with when it comes to utilizing that ammo. They look at it from a standpoint of, well, I mean, how much could it hurt you from just getting a background check? Well, you don't factor in the fees that are involved with that. So what about the people who don't necessarily have the resources like you had to actually deal with what you had to deal with for the time period that you did? What about the people who just want to get ammo so that they can actually go and practice with their firearm? But now there's an added cost to that, and then now they have to undergo that process, and then in backdoor they'll then say, okay, well, people should get all the training, and you should be able to shoot your gun really, really well in order to carry and own a gun and have a gun in your possession. But then you create laws that make it harder for people to become proficient with their firearm. It's kind of like this one big ball of stupidity that just keeps building on itself. And for some reason, the leaders in California think that adding more stupidity to stupidity is somehow going to make them come out as geniuses. And I'm kind of blown away by it at this point, because I'm like, well, go ahead.
Yeah, well, whenever you look at bills, almost any type of bill you see that's put forward, whatever they call it or whatever the first line is, that's generally not what it does, right? Yeah. So Prop 63 isn't really for background checks on people purchasing ammunition. It's to ban the sale of ammunition via the internet. Yeah. And to everyone who was grandfathered in on 30-round magazines, it went from you're going to be grandfathered in to essentially confiscation. And that's one of those things that you hear a lot of people, they're like, well, you should just register your gun, it's fine, and everything. And you hear people say, oh, you're just one of those tinfoil hat guys that you think that the government's going to come take your guns. Well, you start looking at these things and it's like, oh shit, they really are. They're starting to say you need to register this or you need to take this, and you can't have this. It's no longer grandfathered in. Well, it took how many years? It took 16 years for them to do that. It was the same thing with the. I mean, it's just,
go ahead. I mean, no, you're right.
Buttons, everything.
It's a taking. It's a taking over a progression period of time. And you're right. It becomes even more frustrating. Again, I have to keep going back to that. And I know it's easier said than done. But just like if you haven't been involved in the conversation, don't come in here and start acting like you know what you're talking about. Don't come in here and try to make it look like I'm crazy, like I'm this conspiracy theorist who thinks that the government's coming to take my guns, and I have no reason for thinking that. When you just so beautifully pointed out, at one point there were certain magazines that were grandfathered in. I was okay with them. I can have them. Now all of a sudden Prop 63 comes out, and I no longer can have these things. I don't know about you, but that sounds like a taking to me.
Yeah, well, how many people in 2000 were like, you know what, they're going to pass this. I'm going to buy 100 30-round magazines. I'll be fine. I won't need any more. That's fine. We'll concede this. And then here it goes 16 years later. It's like, oh, okay, how many times did you replace those springs in there and everything? You're like, all right, well, whatever. They didn't know if these pre-existed or not. And, it's like, well, now you come to the point where it's like you really have to be vigilant. Just every single year, every single election cycle, and educating yourself and what's going on at the ballot box and why.
Yeah, absolutely. And I just wish that was a message that can get out to the vast majority of people. Because I've been in the booth before and looked at some propositions, and I sat in the booth. It was like damn near 2 pages, and I'm looking at the thing and I'm like, I really don't even know what this is saying right now. And then I've read it over 3 or 4 times, and then considering the background I have, imagine somebody who doesn't have that background.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's hard whenever you're in the voting booth and you haven't educated. And it's my belief that if I see a measure or something like that, and I'm not educated on it, I'm not going to vote on it.
I don't. Yeah, that's what I do.
Because half of the time you see the Affordable Health Care Act, the Patriot Act. It's like, oh, that sounds awesome. Who wouldn't want to vote for the Patriot Act? Yep. And it's like, okay, well, you need to really take the time to speak with somebody who either knows about it, go through the legislation and everything, and see how it's really going to affect it. Because when you on the surface, again, you look at it, and you're like, okay, background checks for ammunition. That doesn't sound like the worst thing in the world. But then when you look at it, it's like, oh wait, then that's going to impede interstate commerce. Yeah, absolutely. Because you're not going to be able to be a California resident and buy in Nevada ammunition. Or I don't know how that'll work. I mean, I guess you could because they don't ID in Nevada, but you would essentially be breaking the law as a Californian, right? Because they're not running a background check on you. So there's so many things that will have to be tried over the next few years and everything, and just hopefully, with the Supreme Court justice nomination and everything, a lot of these things that aren't necessarily constitutional get tried and thrown away, like the the ban on, say, 50 caliber rifles in the state of California and stuff like that. So
absolutely. Well, Richard's going to join us, continue to join us. He's going to keep hanging out with us. I'm going to take a quick break, and when we come back, we're going to talk some 50 caliber shooting, because he didn't know until recently that when I shot a 50 cal with him on the show, that was my first time. So we'll be back.